You see the charm first. Tall columns, lace ironwork, porches that catch the last amber of a Louisiana sun. You see moss-draped oaks, lanterns reflected on black water, a slow river that has watched generations pass. But behind those facades, something else lingers. The wood remembers footsteps that stopped in the dark. The walls keep the hush of voices that will not be quiet. These are not merely houses. They are places that, locals say, hold on to their histories, and sometimes those histories speak back. Louisiana's 12 most haunted houses. Even ghost hunters run away. The claim is stark because the witnesses are not credulous strangers on a thrill-seeking weekend. The accounts come from people who have trained to listen for the slightest anomaly. Paranormal investigators, long-serving caretakers, tour guides who return for years. Time and again, what began as curiosity became something else. A sudden dread, a voice recorded on an EVP that orders you to get out, a team packing up equipment in the cold hours and leaving before dawn. Throughout Louisiana, beauty and terror sit shoulder to shoulder, and the bravest often leave with their questions unanswered and their nerves frayed. If you want more haunted history, like and subscribe. Only one quick tap, and you won't miss the rest of this chilling tour. Madame Laurie's Mansion. A shadowed mansion on a bluff from the river, the Laurie Mansion looks like a portrait framed in black iron and magnolias. Broad windows, shuttered balconies, an air that speaks of wealth and secrets. Historically, locals place the mansion squarely in a lineage of wealth built on a difficult past. Stories tied to the house speak of intrafamily violence, of rooms that witnessed arguments and disappearances, accounts that historians treat as local lore unless corroborated. The house's past, witnesses say, is layered. Prosperity in public, pain in private. The haunting that keeps this place in whispered conversation centers on Madame Laurie, a figure in local accounts remembered less as a legend and more as a presence. Visitors report footsteps in halls long after the house is locked. Staff report cold patches that gather like breath on the back of the neck, and sometimes the scent of perfume where no one was wearing any. One caretaker, who left after years of service, described waking in the small hours to the sound of someone, an unseen hand, rapping on the bedroom door. She says she found the door latched but not open, and the knock continued until dawn. Investigators who have spent nights there report instruments behaving erratically, temperature drops captured by thermal cameras, EMF readings that spike near the staircase, and a few EVPs with a voice that a technician later transcribed as calling a name, reportedly an old family name tied to local lore. It was a command, not a whisper, a visiting investigator told a reporter. It felt like the house was telling us we weren't welcome. On at least one occasion, a team packed up their equipment at 2 a.m. and left, shaken, before they had completed the survey. Standing on the lawn and watching the house at dusk, you can feel the tension, an elegance that disguises tumult. The story of the Laurie Mansion is not spectacle. It's a reminder that some homes keep the echoes of private violence in rooms visitors rarely see. The Myrtles Plantation, a postcard of Spanish moss and a piano in the parlor. Myrtles Plantation arrives in the mind like a photograph. A white clapboard house framed by oaks, a long drive that leads to a porch where a wind chime taps out a steady, eerie rhythm. Local accounts anchor Myrtles in the plantation era, a place where the labor and lives of the enslaved were at the heart of daily work. Visit with reverence. Many of the reported manifestations are situated against that history and the profound suffering within it. The plantation's best-known story concerns a figure named Chloe, a servant in the retellings, though versions of her tale vary widely in detail and credibility. Local lore, passed along on tours and in guidebooks, says Chloe was punished for an alleged theft, and that a tragic end followed. Many visitors report seeing a woman in period dress near a mirror or finding handprints on the glass from no visible hand. The parlor piano is another recurring image. Guests and guides have told of the instrument beginning to play on its own. A single melody, soft and deliberate, as if someone unseen were practicing in the next room. Children's laughter is another frequent report, too faint to belong to any living guest on the property. Tour guides often speak of an atmosphere that thickens as the sun dips. Voices, soft whispers in empty corridors, and on occasion, a photograph that will catch a face where no one stood. An overnight investigator described recording an EVP that, when played back, contained the phrase, "Get out," though he and his team heard nothing live. After that night, he said 3 members left before dawn, pale and unsteady, saying the place felt wrong in a way they could not explain. The ethical weight of Myrtles' stories is not lost on those who retell them. Many caretakers and guides emphasize that the tales must be told with respect for the people, enslaved and free, whose lives were bound to that place. The ghost stories sit uneasily alongside the plantation's history, and for many, the hauntings are not entertainment, but a reminder of incurred suffering that echoes across generations. Oak Alley Plantation, a promenade of oaks and the shadow of small feet. Approach Oak Alley and the Avenue of Oaks grabs you first. A cathedral of moss and branches forming a tunnel of living stone, guiding you toward a grand white house that could be a stage set for Southern grandeur. Historically, Oak Alley is inseparable from plantation life. The rows of oaks were planted decades ago and have witnessed centuries of change. The stories that haunt the house overlap with a broader pattern in plantation lore. The idea that sites of sustained trauma retain an imprint, a memory. The phenomena reported at Oak Alley Center on small, shifting presences. Visitors say they have felt a tug at hems, as if little hands reached out in play or in need. Others report seeing a child on the wide balcony, then realizing no child was there. One night, a caretaker on the back steps told a visiting team he had felt the unmistakable sensation of someone sliding a small hand into his own. An experience he described as tender and heartbreaking rather than threatening. In contrast, some guests have felt sudden, inexplicable chills that move up the spine and leave a lingering sorrow. Investigators touring the property have recorded soft footsteps in rooms that were empty, and at least one video frame appears to show a pale figure passing behind a curtain where no one was standing. "We're trained to read the data," an investigator said. "But the feeling there, something about the smallness of some presences, makes your equipment feel irrelevant. It's an ache more than a shock." A visiting paranormal team chose to cut a nighttime session short after multiple team members awoke with the same image in their heads. A child reaching toward them, silent and insistent. Walking under the oaks, the contrast is striking. A majestic landscape that has become, for many, a corridor to the past. Beautiful and burdened. Bocage Plantation. White columns, a hush in the halls. Bocage's silhouette is the sort you see in travel guides. Broad veranda, columns at the front like watchful sentinels, and a yard that drops toward a slow-moving bayou. Local accounts place Bocage within the same sorrowful template of plantation stories. Wealth built on the backs of many laborers whose names were seldom recorded. Those histories inform how witnesses interpret what happens inside. At Bocage, the most persistent reports come from the old nursery and the back staircase. Caretakers have told of lullabies heard behind closed nursery doors and of a rocking chair gently moving though no one sits in it. Visitors sometimes catch the scent of talc or faint perfume in rooms otherwise empty. One guide recounted a winter evening when several tourists noticed a small pair of wet footprints on the nursery floor, leading to the window and stopping at the sill, though none reported an actual child being present. Investigators report sporadic electronic interference in particular rooms. Audio equipment that clicks and then falls silent. EMF spikes near a specific corner of the nursery, and a camera that once stopped recording for several minutes before returning with footage that, by all accounts, shows a faint, translucent shape crossing the threshold. It's less about jolts, an investigator told a local paper, and more about persistent impressions, soft but insistent things that humanize the place's sorrow. After a long, cold night, one veteran decided he had enough. He left before the sun rose, saying, "There's a heaviness there that isn't curiosity. It's grief." Bogard Key's house. Narrow porches and a voice in the dark. The Bogard Key's house sits on a small street where the humidity hangs low, and the porch light seems to suggest welcome. Its windows glow at dusk, with a domestic sort of warmth that makes it all the stranger as a place of unease. The historical threads here are thinner in public record, and witnesses are careful to say that many details are part of local memory rather than formal history. That uncertainty does not, however, diminish the reported encounters. The haunting most frequently reported at Bogard Keys involves a doorway and a voice. Residents, both past and present, describe hearing a clear voice in the hall at night that says a simple phrase. Reportedly, "Go," or in some accounts the harsher, "Get out." The voice is described as neither male nor female, but simply authoritative. One family that lived in the house for several years told a story of waking to find all the interior doors open when they had closed them for the night. The family dog would refuse to enter certain rooms after midnight. A visiting investigative group recorded a short EVP that, when slowed and analyzed, seemed to contain consonants that matched "Get out." The group did not claim this as proof. They framed it as one data point among many that left them uneasy. "We left early," one member admitted. "It's an old house, sure, but every hair on my arms was standing up. We didn't need more than that." Bogard Keys is an example of a domestic haunt, unassuming architecture, familiar rooms, and an intensity that focuses on presence rather than spectacle. For those who lived there, the sense of being watched or warned became a part of daily life. San Francisco Plantation House. Sunlight on shutters and a presence at the piano. From the levee, the San Francisco Plantation House looks almost fragile. Delicate embellishments, shuttered porches, an air that suggests a quiet dignity. Historically, the house is tied to the long and fraught history of plantations along Louisiana's waterways. As with the others, the stories locals tell are threaded through with the knowledge of enslaved labor and the interpersonal tragedies that sometimes unfolded in such settings. At San Francisco, the reports again return to sound. The piano, rooms that cough up music in empty hours, voices that seem to answer questions with fragments. Closing a door can bring a small, cold exhale that the room seems reluctant to give back. One longtime employee described walking into the main parlor to find a chair slightly turned and a sheet of music on the piano, with keys that had been depressed, as if invisible fingers had been practicing an old tune. Paranormal teams who have visited mention a particularly unsettling night when their audio captured a sentence that sounded like, "Leave now." Several members of the group described feeling compelled to obey. You can try to beleaguer your rational side to reduce it to acoustics or hall dynamics, one investigator said afterward. But the sensation that accompanied the voice was different, an urgency that felt like a warning. That evening, the team ended their session early. One person who stayed in the house for a final minute said she felt watched by something not intent on harm, but intent on being noticed. Between the piano's notes and the hush of shuttered rooms, the San Francisco Plantation House retains a quiet that, for some visitors, deepens into unease. A pattern, beauty stitched to sorrow. As we move between these houses, a pattern emerges. The same architectural grace that draws travelers, columns, balconies, careful gardens, also hides histories that were often violent, exploitative, or marked by sudden loss. Witnesses and investigators frequently connect the two, treating hauntings not as entertainment, but as echoes, a theory that local lore often supports. Trauma leaves an imprint on place. This is not a single explanation any historian would accept without evidence, and most researchers will caution against simple causal claims. "We record, we analyze, and we leave room for ambiguity," a lead investigator told a regional magazine. Yet the emotional through line is hard to ignore. Those who report the most frequent or persistent phenomena often do so at sites where human lives were concentrated, constrained, or cut short. The houses we have moved through so far are early chapters in a longer story. Each has its own texture. Madame Laurie's authoritative echoes, the childlike presences at Oak Alley, the pleading or commanding voices of Bogard Keys and San Francisco. In every case, witnesses describe sensation before interpretation. A cold spot that gathers like breath, the soft pressure of absent fingers, a melody played by no hand. Those sensations and the reactions they provoke are what led trained teams to stop their work and leave. Expertise, it turns out, does not inoculate against fear. Huma's house, weathered siding and a sudden shadow. Huma's house is less monumental than some plantations, a narrow facade, faded paint, a porch that leans slightly as if listening. It sits in a neighborhood where everyday life keeps moving, which makes the reports from this house all the more chilling to neighbors. Local stories about humas are brief but persistent. The accounts focus on sudden apparitions, shapes that stand at the top of the stairs or in the doorway, and on a peculiar repetition. Several residents and visitors have reported seeing the same figure over different years, a silhouette that tilts its head as if curious. One former tenant described returning late from work to find the hallway light dimly lit and a figure standing at the end of the corridor. She froze. The shape remained still for a moment, turned, and then vanished as if drawn through a wall. She quit the next week, telling friends that the house felt occupied by someone else's memories. Investigators recorded a faint EVP in which a voice, hushed and unreadable at the time, later sounded like the word "stay." That fragility, half command, half plea, left the team unsettled. One member said they left sooner than planned because multiple team members reported dreams that night of being watched on their own porches at home. Huma's house is a reminder that hauntings do not need grand architecture to be profound. Intimacy can be just as disquieting as grandeur, because a small domestic space concentrates attention. The reports there point not to spectacle, but to encounters that unsettle the ordinary rhythms of life. Magnolia Plantation, a house of white shutters and persistent footsteps. Magnolia presents a postcard image: white shutters, a walk lined with low hedges, and a porch that invites conversation on warm afternoons. But beneath that hospitality, some visitors say the house holds a deeper sorrow. As with the other plantations, Magnolia's stories are entwined with a past where labor was coerced and lives overshadowed by the priorities of wealth. Many caretakers make a point of framing the hauntings in that context, insisting that we speak of people, not props. The phenomena reported at Magnolia are often auditory: a set of footsteps in the parlor when guests are in the kitchen, the soft pad of someone moving through an upstairs room, the muffled sound of a child's weeping that fades as you approach. One longtime housekeeper recounted an evening when she followed the sound of stairs and found nothing but a small indentation on a chair cushion, as if weight had recently been present and then removed. A visiting investigative team recorded a thermal anomaly in an otherwise empty hallway, a cold shape that corresponded in their footage to no physical being. One investigator, after a lengthy night, said that the place left them with a sense of unfinished business, moments where everyday life had been abruptly halted. Several members of the night team reported an instantaneous rush of nausea and vertigo around 3 in the morning, after which 2 of them decided they could not stay. They packed up and left without explanation beyond the simple statement: it felt wrong. Across Magnolia's rooms, the senses of people returned to small domestic rituals: walking, settling into a chair, or moving through doorways, then interrupted. For many who visit, that ordinary disruption is the most haunting thing of all. Andrew Jackson Hotel. Urban gloss and a corridor that hushes. Shifting from plantations, the Andrew Jackson Hotel sits in an older part of a city where the streets hum with life and history. Its facade is grand in a different register: brass doorknobs, a lobby that remembers suitcases and long conversations. In this urban setting, the stories lean away from plantation-era trauma and towards sudden death and public conflict. Accidents, perhaps, or violence connected to political life. As always, witnesses emphasize that these are local accounts rather than official history. What unsettles people most here are the corridors at night. Guests have reported the unmistakable sound of someone running down a hallway when the place is empty, and the faint odor of pipe tobacco that seems to move from room to room. One night clerk, who has worked graveyards for years, described an evening when he walked the 3rd floor and felt a hand brush his shoulder, though no one stood near him. He left his post trembling and asked to be reassigned. Paranormal investigators who surveyed the hotel noted a recurring EVP captured near room 312, a voice that spoke a single name, unintelligible at the time, clearer on playback, and then indecipherable again when reviewed by other ears. "We left early," an investigator told a local paper. "We were hoping to get more, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming." The Andrew Jackson Hotel demonstrates how hauntings in urban settings often take on the texture of abruptness, footsteps and smells that announce a presence rather than shape it into narrative. Herman Grimmer House. Shuttered windows and the sudden slam. The Herman Grimmer House is a well-framed domestic structure. A wide porch, a set of stairs that lead to a heavy door, and a yard that is mostly quiet. Neighbors note the house's oddness in stories more than in any physical sign. Here the phenomenon reported most often is abrupt and startling. Doors that slam without wind, glass that rattles though the air is still. One evening, a family staying in a guest room awoke to the sound of a loud bang. They found nothing broken, but the sound had clearly come from the adjacent locked room, an impossible origin that drove them from the bed and eventually from the house altogether. Investigators who returned to the site reported EMF anomalies localized around a downstairs parlor and a few clear EVP clips that contained single words, sometimes addressed to the investigators themselves. We had a clip where the voice said, "Go," one said. "When you're trained to listen, you learn to be skeptical. But even skepticism doesn't keep your heart from racing when it feels like the house is telling you what to do." The Herman Grimmer House sits as a case example of the domestic suddenness that can transform ordinary nights into high anxiety for those who live or work there. Old State Capitol, stone and shadow in public corridors. Turning to a public building, the Old State Capitol shows a different scale. Stone staircases, echoing corridors, and a history of political drama that can leave a lasting imprint on a place where strong emotions were once staged. Local lore ties the building to contentious events, debates turned ugly, public figures threatened. But precise histories vary, and many dramatic details remain part of oral tradition rather than archival confirmation. Reports here focus on the sense of being watched in empty chambers and on occasional apparitions in period dress near the balconies. Security guards and custodial staff have both reported hearing debate-like murmurs in rooms that are closed for the night. One guard said he saw, on a quiet afternoon, the shadow of a figure pass behind a curtain where no one was standing and then felt a sudden coldness that remained long after the figure had ostensibly moved on. A visiting team recorded a series of faint EVPs in a closed chamber that, when reviewed, sounded like fragments of speeches. The investigators were careful to note that such recordings could be the result of acoustics or previous broadcasts caught in the architecture, but several members left with the same impression. The building keeps the residue of public fury and private fear, and that residue can feel uncomfortably active. Cornstalk Hotel. Final stop in this sequence, a lobby of whispers. The Cornstalk Hotel, so named in local parlance for a motif long since faded, has a lobby that always seems slightly colder than the street outside. It's a place where the hum of normal life meets something quieter, and for some, far older. Here, the reports converge on two elements: a recurring apparition described as a woman in a long, dark dress, and the sensation of being guided or pushed toward the exit, as if the building itself were intent on clearing its space of intruders. Guests have told of waking to find their belongings shifted and an unaccountable urge to leave the room. One late-night housekeeper reported a distinct voice that said, "You don't belong here," though when she turned on the light, she found no one. A team of investigators once attempted a full overnight vigil in the Cornstalk. They recorded multiple EVPs and, crucially for our title claim, they left hours before dawn. Some members pale and shaken, unwilling to explain more than that. It felt like the building was trying to get rid of us. Even those trained to stand firm found themselves second-guessing. That is the through line of many of these accounts. Expertise meets place, and place pushes back. A longer darkness, and what it asks of us by now, a pattern is clear. In the hush of these houses, people repeatedly report the same basic sensations: cold spots, sounds in empty rooms, the smell of tobacco or perfume in the wrong time and place, a voice urging departure. The reactions are also similar: caretakers who resign, tourists who hurry away, investigators who pack up and leave before their work is done. It would be easy to reduce these responses to theatrics or to the misfiring of equipment. Many investigators, clinical in their methods, invite exactly that critique. They test, they cross-check, they seek plausible explanations. Yet across these 12 houses, and the 6 we've just visited, there is something else at play: the emotional gravity of history. Where lives were constrained, where sudden or violent ends occurred, people report a different quality of encounter. Witnesses frequently connect the phenomena to that history as a matter of moral gravity. These houses, they say, are not merely sites of scare. They are the places where memory presses against the living. We have moved, in this segment, from the grand and notorious to the modest and affine, and the tension has risen not by spectacle, but by intimacy. Stories of Madame Laurie, Chloe, and the small presences at Oak Alley are not meant to titillate. They are, for many, the only traces the past still yields in a landscape that otherwise strives for preservation and tourism. Ahead, the remaining houses in this carefully selected dozen promise encounters that push further. Reports of violent flashes, recordings that confuse even the most seasoned analysts, and accounts of investigators who left in the dark rather than waiting for daylight. The line between skepticism and submission grows thinner the longer you listen. We have paused at a juncture where each house has told a quiet, potent story. Some of these accounts come from people who know the protocols, veteran investigators who insist on empirical rigor. Others come from caretakers and residents whose lives were altered by an evening, a sound, a photograph. Together they form an uneasy chorus. You begin to understand why the title, that even ghost hunters run away, doesn't feel like hyperbole to the people who were there. Tonight's segment closes with that unsettled feeling still in the air. The next houses hold darker reputations and reports that, for some, crossed from discomfort into terror. The instruments, the cameras, the skeptics, each has a breaking point. And in Louisiana, the architecture of the living sometimes becomes a threshold the living do not cross. If you've ever felt the pull of a house that will not let go, you understand the thinness between curiosity and retreat. The next house on our list is known for a presence that many say is not content to be watched. It watches back, and it moves, and it has driven experienced teams from a room before they could finish a single sweep. We continue, but pause here, in the hush, and listen for what comes after the last recorded EVP. The hush thickens, as if the air itself is listening for the next confession. The houses ahead, locals warn, are not content with being observed. They insist. They pace, they push, and sometimes they make even the seasoned walk away. Myrtle's Plantation, the mirror that remembers faces. If you thought you'd already heard the fullest version of Myrtle's, stay. The house's parlor keeps returning stories, and some of the nights recorded there are the sort that unsettle people long after the equipment has been packed. One investigator who spent consecutive nights inside the parlor described the sensation best. There was a weight, like you were standing inside a held breath. He told of cameras set along the room's perimeter, of thermal spots that appeared and elongated along the baseboard like living shadows. At 3 a.m, a motion detector triggered. The video showed no guest, no caretaker, only the old mirror above the mantel clouding for a long second and then clearing to reveal, impossibly, a pale face that holds for a frame and is gone. The team slowed the footage. No reflection could account for what they saw, they reported. Still, they were careful to call it a recorded anomaly rather than proof. Visitors often point to the piano, where the keys sometimes depress in patterns that make no musical sense and yet carry the cadence of a practiced hand. One night, a caretaker who had worked at Myrtle's for years said she awoke to faint music and found the bench slightly displaced as if someone had just risen. She touched the keys. They were warm. She left the room and later told investigators, "It felt like someone had been practicing the way you would before company, nervous and precise. That mixture of domestic intimacy and impossibility is what unsettles trained investigators. An action that reads as human, practice, ritual, without any person present." Perhaps most chilling are the photographs that tourists sometimes bring back. In one image, a child's face appears pressed to a window pane where no child stood the entire afternoon. In another, a woman in period dress seems to occupy a reflection that the room itself refuses to acknowledge. Guides repeat these images with a caution born of respect. They pair them with reminders about the real human lives that form the backdrop of the hauntings. For many who visit, Myrtle's is less about spectacle and more about the careful, repeated return of certain presences, faces that look for recognition and, some witnesses say, do not always find it. Madame Laurie's mansion. The staircase that will not be ignored. Madame Laurie's presence lingers in ways that feel directive. Where Myrtle's often returns images of domestic ritual, the Laurie mansion, witnesses say, communicates in posture and pressure. It is a house that tells you, quietly and insistently, that you are trespassing on its terms. One paranormal team recounted an episode on a long staircase that creaks even when the house is still. The team had positioned a camera at the landing and an EMF reader on the banister. As they watched the night feed, they noticed the shadow at the foot of the stairs. Nothing solid, but a darkness that pooled as if someone were sitting and watching. The lead investigator whispered into her recorder about feeling an almost maternal scrutiny. Then the EMF spiked, the banister registering a sharp needle of activity directly opposite the dark pool. And on playback, a low-frequency sound, a tone too steady to be random, sounded like the intake of a single breath. The team, shaken by the focused nature of the encounter, chose to break the session early. It wasn't violent, one member later said. It was corrective, as if the house were saying, "This is mine." Caretakers speak of doors that latch themselves and of perfume carrying down a corridor with no one wearing it. Small domestic signifiers that form an insistence, a private etiquette that insists on being observed. A house like Laurie's, witnesses suggest, does not merely echo, it polices its rooms. For the investigators who left, the sensation was not of danger in the physical sense, but of a boundary that had been crossed. The kind of trespass that makes people, trained or not, want to leave. Oak Alley Plantation. Children's footsteps and the ache of absence. Oak Alley's avenue of live oaks is an image travelers carry home, but beneath that gallery of branches there is a quieter, more persistent kind of haunting. The smallness that returns again and again in reports of touches and tentative encounters. Several night teams have attested to what they describe as contact. Gentle, brief, as if an unseen child reached out to confirm your presence. One investigator described standing on the porch and feeling a light tug at her sleeve, as if a small hand had caught the fabric. She turned, expecting to see a stray child from the tour. There was no one. Her voice, still tight, said, "It felt oddly patient, like someone checking whether they were seen." Other reports carry more sorrow than shock. While touring the balcony, a guest described seeing a small figure stand, watch, and then move away as if pulled by a sudden memory. Video from that night shows an indistinct movement across the railing and nothing more. But the audio picked up, faintly, what some interpret as a child's humming. In the morning, several team members reported having the same dream of a child hiding beneath bed curtains, small, frightened, and refusing to be comforted. Investigators often leave Oak Alley with a feeling not of fear, but of mourning. The sensation that they have intruded upon the minutiae of a life that can't be concluded. For many, this is the most disturbing quality. The hauntings are not dramatic flashes, but private gestures repeated until someone notices. Bocage Plantation. Lullabies and the slow machinery of grief. At Bocage, the nursery keeps calling. Lullaby reports are common, but the way the episodes unfold gives them weight. A rocking chair that begins to move in the trusted tempo of a mother's hand. The smell of powder in a room emptied for decades. Small wet footprints that appear on dusty floors. One late-night account involved a visiting researcher who followed a lullaby down a hallway. The voice was thin and old, a melody sung in a measured cadence. When he opened the nursery door, the light inside was as though someone had just left. Toys arranged as if waiting, a blanket slightly rumpled. The thermal camera the researcher carried showed only a blur of cool air that pooled by the window for a few moments before dissipating. He described the feeling afterward as standing in the presence of unfinished caregiving, a domestic duty that continued past the point of a physical body. In investigative terms, Bocage's anomalies often come as interruptions, cameras that will not operate in one corner, audio tracks that drop out in the middle of sentences. Teams say the experience is accumulative. Small disturbances pile up into an emotional weight that forces a choice. One long-serving investigator admitted, "You can explain many things away, but after a night of small, precise interactions that feel like someone tending to the same corner of a room for 100 years, you begin to respect the narrative." Bogard Key's house. The voice at the threshold. Bogard Keyes' hauntings often return to a single feature: the threshold. Doorways are boundary markers, and witnesses report a voice that insists on enforcing them. A family that rented the house for a season explained how, for months, certain doors would return to an open position the morning after they closed them. At odd hours, a voice, recorded by a motion-activated camera in the hallway, said a terse instruction: reportedly, leave. When played back at half speed, some team members discerned consonants that might correlate to that phrase. Others remained unconvinced, suggesting mechanical interference. The family's response was visceral. The dog would not enter the darkened second bedroom after midnight, and one parent began sleeping with his back to the door out of apprehension. Investigators often described the voice as neither threatening nor tender, but as unmistakably possessive, a command that feels like an eviction notice. A lead researcher who had worked in electronic surveillance for years conceded that such clarity in a single human-like order to leave was unnerving precisely because it left no room for debate. They finished their sweep, packed equipment, and left earlier than planned, citing a collection of small but consistent disturbances that culminated in the voice. San Francisco Plantation House. Music, reply, and the hush between notes. San Francisco returns to sound, but it compounds it with the sense of conversational exchange. Voices do not merely echo here. In some accounts, they answer questions. One investigative group attempted a controlled interview in the main parlor. They asked aloud, "Who's here?" and left a minute of silence to listen. On playback, the audio captured a fragmentary reply that some team members insisted sounded like, "Now." Others dismissed it as stray noise. The disagreement about interpretation, however, did not erase the physical sensations. Multiple team members reported a pressure in the chest as if someone had taken an observational stance toward their bodies. Caretakers speak of the piano as an interlocutor, responding to presence rather than articulating messages. Tourists sometimes report that the piano's notes arrive after a rhetorical pause, as if the instrument is commenting on the room's mood. One overnight volunteer found a page of music lying on the bench at dawn, not placed there when they locked up the night before. The volunteer's hands trembled when she told investigators, because the notation, though simple, was identical to a lullaby her grandmother used to play. The convergence of private memory and public artifact is what unsettles many who work at San Francisco. Huma's house, a domestic gaze that follows. Huma's house is quieter than the plantations, but it yields a different kind of pressure. The feeling that a life once lived in those rooms has maintained a watchfulness, tracking present-day comings and goings. A tenant reported that on several mornings, small items, glasses, shoes, appeared moved to the other side of the hallway, arranged as if placed by someone with a habit for order. She laughed it off until, during a late-night power outage, she felt a presence at the top of the stairs, a silhouette that tilted its head as if trying to read her expression. She left shortly after and spoke of a domestic intelligence that observed and adjusted. Investigators who followed up recorded a whisper on a broken audio channel that, when cleaned, suggested the word "stay." Ambiguous in intent, it sounded at once pleading and entreating. For teams accustomed to dramatic manifestations, Huma's is a study in persistence. The phenomena are subtle, moves of objects, dreams repeated by multiple team members, a pattern of impressions that point not to spectacle but to continuity. Over time, that continuity can be unsettling enough to end an investigation early. Magnolia Plantation. Footsteps that circle the heart. Magnolia's reports return to footsteps and to the particular way those steps trace routines. A kitchen path, a bedroom tread, the circle of someone moving from table to window. One documented night described by a housekeeper involved a looping set of steps in the parlor, heard at intervals across a 3-hour span. Technically, the house was empty, save for the housekeeper, who followed the sound to find only a chair slightly askew. Cameras showed a thermal cold bubble following the same path as the sounds. When the housekeeper later described the route, she explained that it followed the pattern of someone checking rooms and returning to the parlor, as if ensuring the house's order. 2 investigators developed headaches and nausea after persistent exposure to the sounds, symptoms they linked to altered acoustics and an overwhelming sense of unfinished tasks. One of them left before dawn, admitting that the disquiet was not solely the noises, but the understanding that they were witnessing someone's routine paused and resumed without a body. Andrew Jackson Hotel. A corridor's hush that echoes reputation. In urban settings like the Andrew Jackson Hotel, the hauntings are often episodic and abrupt, but capable of slipping into a persistence that makes staying intolerable. The hotel's corridors have produced examples of such episodes, where the sensorial facts, sound, smell, touch, combine into a cumulative pressure. The night clerk who once felt a hand brush his shoulder later described an afternoon when a guest awakened to the scent of pipe tobacco lingering in a room where no smoker had been. The smell moved through the suite as if carried by an invisible conversation. Security footage showed curtains moving though there was no breeze. Investigators who tried to chart patterns traced several similar incidents to midweek hours between midnight and 3 a.m., and a window when the building's traffic had dropped to very low levels. On one such night, team members reported an oppressive awareness as if the corridors themselves were listening. After hours of recorded static, a voice, clear and human, said a name on the feed. The team reviewed and left, unsettled that a building devoted to travelers might keep a memory so attached to a particular sound. Herman Grimmer House. The impossible bang. The Herman Grimmer House's sudden, inexplicable noises have a way of puncturing a night's rhythm in a single moment. Those bangs and slams are not dramatic in cinematic terms, but are close enough to normal household accidents to be puzzling when they occur with nothing tangible to cause them. A family sleeping on the second floor once awoke to a noise that resembled a door slamming with force. They investigated but found every door closed and a set of glass panes unchecked. Later, the downstairs room's ambient microphone captured, as an overlay on otherwise clean sound, a single sharp impact, followed by a long, draining silence that no one could explain. The family left the next morning, their explanation succinct. We didn't sleep. Investigators who examined the house found EMF spikes in the same parlor on different nights and recorded voice fragments that sounded like single-syllable commands, brief, isolating, and unnerving. The house, in several accounts, communicates with abrupt punctuation, a line drawn with a single bang. Old State Capitol. Where public emotion lingers. Public buildings have a different register of haunting, the residue of argument, the echo of performances and speeches. The Old State Capitol fits this pattern, its stone stairwells and balconies offering acoustics that feed returnings of temperament and rhetoric. Security staff reported occasionally hearing the low murmur of an argument in a chamber that had been empty for hours. On one occasion, a maintenance worker walked in during a quiet weekday to the sound of debate, a measured, rising cadence, and for a moment he thought an exhibit had been left playing. There was no audio source. A visiting team recorded audio fragments that resembled rhetorical cadences on an EVP, and one member described a sudden, overwhelming sense of exposure, as if the building itself remembered the force of words spoken within it. That sense of exposure made some leave. The experience of being under public scrutiny, even from absent speakers, proved difficult to tolerate through the small hours. Cornstalk Hotel. The exit that becomes an instruction. We reach again the Cornstalk, its lobby colder than the street, the kind of place where the air seems to form an opinion about you. The Cornstalk's most unnerving reports are those that approach persuasion. Guests wake unsettled, belongings moved, and an urge to leave that deepens into compulsion. One investigative team attempted a controlled sit-in in a second-floor room. Cameras framed the room, audio was calibrated, and a small group prepared to remain until dawn. Around 2:30, their recorders caught a whisper, distinctly, "You don't belong." The team replayed and replayed, turning up the gain until the words became a chorus of syllables. Some members swore they felt nudges at their ankles, light touches that moved them toward the door. Others reported a rising pressure in their lungs that eased only when they stood. One of the investigators later admitted, "We left because it felt like the building itself wanted to be empty of us." They packed gear in the dark and drove away before sunrise. That willingness of a space to assert itself is what ties many of these houses together. It is not always about the visible. It is about the pressure a place exerts, about a sensation that staying longer will only deepen the trespass. For investigators trained in rigor, that is often the most unsettling evidence, an unspoken verdict, collectively felt. When expertise meets an unquiet house, throughout these accounts, a recurring detail keeps returning. The people who claim to leave early are often the ones least given to dramatics. They are technicians, skeptics, caretakers with a night's routine. Their threshold for panic is not low. So when they decide to leave, the statement has weight. One veteran investigator who has worked dozens of sites across the American South offered a reflection that helps explain the thought process. He described how patterns, not a single event, usually prompt retreat. Repeated EVPs that seem to address the team. Thermal readings that suggest movement where none should be possible. Cameras that record clear anomalies and then glitch beyond repair. It's the steady accumulation, he said. You can remain skeptical and tallied when anomalies are a one-off, but when they arrive like a chorus and begin to address you personally, you make a call. You leave. You respect the fact that you don't own the narrative. Teams often detail the procedural steps they take before abandoning a site. Cross-checking equipment, leaving lights on as tests, opening windows to rule out drafts, and conducting controlled audio tests. But in the end, the decision to leave is rarely purely technical. It is ethical and psychological. Some investigators frame their early exits as acts of prudence. Others feel shamed by their sudden departure. Professionals who pride themselves on endurance, surprised at the thinness of their resolve. And yet, the title claim, the image of ghost hunters who run away, repeats itself in reports because the choice to quit is something witnesses, time and again, recount. Patterns and responsibilities. If there is a through line in these houses, it is this. Architecture holds memory, and memory acts back. Plantations return small domestic gestures, lullabies, childlike touches, the sound of keys, as if rehearsing interrupted lives. Urban hotels and public buildings return the suddenness of endings. Footsteps, someone running down a hall, voices that seem to thrum with urgency. Domestic homes like Huma's and Bogard Keys focus their energies on thresholds and intimacies. Across the dozen, the shared quality is not spectacle but persistence. Repetition of a sound, a smell, the same face in photographs taken months apart. With that observation comes an ethical obligation. Many caretakers, historians, and even some investigators emphasize the need to speak about these places with care. When the haunting is tied, in local memory, to slavery, to coerced labor, or to entangled violence, telling the story becomes an exercise in witness rather than entertainment. A guide at a plantation once told a visiting team, "Don't make them into ghosts for your dinner table." It was a rebuke and a reminder. Hauntings that arise from human suffering deserve more than sensationalizing. They require respect. At the same time, the human impulse to seek, to record, to explain is not vanishing. Investigative teams return to these houses because they cannot ignore the reports, because tools can detect anomalies, and because some mysteries resist neat classification. Yet the most striking commonality is this. When the reports pile up, when multiple witnesses across time and roles describe similar sensations, an institutional response often emerges. Caretakers change shifts, guides refuse night tours, and investigators make a different choice. Go home. A final stretch. Encounters that fractured teams. In the closing chapters of our nights in Louisiana, several episodes stand out where a specific encounter fractured the composure of a group. At one plantation, accounts vary as to which, and some details remain indefinido, a team recorded a sequence of EVPs across an hour of silence. Voices emerged that not only told the team to leave, but called out names that matched family names associated with the property according to local law. The combination of specificity and direct address unnerved the group. Members who had been composed for the whole night began to tear down gear with trembling hands. One team member, a veteran with a career spent in forensic audio analysis, left the site mid-session and refused to speak publicly afterward. His silence was, to those who remained, explanation enough. Another team, at a converted urban mansion, discovered their recording devices stopped functioning near the center of the house and resumed only after they had all crossed the threshold of the front door. The footage before the failure showed a pale blur in a corridor. When the devices came back online downstairs, a faint voice on playback urged, "Go." The team, exhausted and unsettled, chose drive hours earlier than planned. They cited accumulated strain on morale, dreams that night, physical unease, a growling sense of being unwelcome. These breaking points are not always dramatic. Often they are quiet resignations, careful people deciding that the night's costs outweigh any possible gain. The title's stark phrasing, "Even ghost hunters run away," is not intended as mockery. It is an observation recorded in testimony across the state. Trained teams, people who make a living distinguishing noise from signal, sometimes fold their tents when the place's insistence becomes personal. What to make of it? A cautious reading. Skepticism remains a healthy part of the conversation. Many investigators insist that acoustic anomalies, temperature gradients, and equipment artifacts often have natural explanations. The region's architecture, thick plaster walls, long corridors, and shifting humidity creates noises and thermal patterns that can confound recordings. Expectation shapes perception. A camera may pick up a latent image that, on first viewing, looks eerie until explained by a light leak or a passing insect near the lens. Yet the persistence of similar reports across disparate witnesses, locations, and eras resists any single tidy explanation. There is an emotional truth in the testimonies. The people who report these events, caretakers, tour guides, families, investigators, often tell stories not for commercial value, but because they are searching for language to describe what they felt. Many use the word respect as a closing line. Treat these places with care. Do not reduce suffering to a single scream. That phrase returns in interviews across the state, a moral thread through narratives that otherwise vary wildly in detail. Memory, architecture, and consequence. If the houses teach anything, they teach us that place and memory intertwine. Architecture does not merely store objects, it accumulates patterns, habits, and echoes that feel at times like residue and at others like agency. Where lives were concentrated and cut short, where orders were given and resisted, where grief was abundant and public, witnesses say that the place remembers differently. This is not a metaphysical claim we can settle with instruments alone. It is a human claim about the way landscapes carry forward the emotional weight of decisions and acts. That recognition brings responsibility. For historians and curators, it means centering the names and experiences of those whose labor and loss formed these houses. For investigators, it means approaching sites with humility and caution. The goal is not conquest, but comprehension. For visitors, it means listening to the people who care for these places and honoring boundaries, literal and moral. A closing image, leaving by dawn. There is a particular hush in the early morning hours when a team that has chosen to stay through the night packs their broken gear in silence and watches the first light wash a facade. They walk out with tired faces and small private gestures, a hand over a mouth, a quiet curse, a folded jacket. Sometimes they drive away without speaking. Sometimes they laugh to relieve tension. Often they call home and say almost nothing because words will not hold the night sensation. Those departures are part of the proof, for some. It is not the camera's image alone that convinces, but the cumulative behavioral response. People who make a career of analysis choose, sometimes, to withdraw. For many witnesses up and down Louisiana, that decision carries meaning. It is the human element in a state of reports and instruments. A trained, measured person pressing their palm to a doorknob and deciding that tonight, enough is enough. A final, restrained reflection. These houses are beautiful in different ways, columned, shuttered, moss-draped, urbane. But what links them is not mere architecture. It is the sense that memory can be lodged in place and that those memories ask for recognition. Whether the cause of the phenomena is metaphysical, psychological, or environmental, the stories carry an ethical dimension that cannot be ignored. We must tell the tales without making the victims into props. We must investigate without fetishizing pain. Across the dozen homes we have described, Witnesses report the same phenomena. Cold spots gathered like breaths, footsteps in empty rooms, music from unfingered keys, voices that command departure, faces in glass that return across years. The people who recorded those experiences, caregivers, tour guides, families, and investigators, often left the same way, quietly, with equipment bundled and curiosity quelled. In Louisiana, beauty and history sit close together, and sometimes the past refuses to remain silent. It speaks. Sometimes it insists you go. If these accounts moved you, if you carry your own stories or questions, share them in the comments below. And if you want more careful explorations of haunted histories, stories told with respect for the people who lived them, subscribe and stay with us for the next tour.